And now we'll talk about reducing the amount of data that we see in a single view. So it's very common to be in a situation where there's simply more to show than is reasonable to show in a single view. So what do? We want to have strategies for reducing either the number of items or the number of attributes that we're showing, of course, in a principled way. And when I say reduce, in some cases, what I mean is either reduce or increase, and we're doing this in an interactive and dynamic way. The two big categories of actions we can do are filtering and aggregation. So let's think a little bit about the pros and cons. Filtering data, that is, just don't show certain things. In many ways, it's straightforward, it's intuitive, it's easy to explain, it's easy to understand. It often gives huge benefits for computation because you're throwing some things away and you don't need to do computations on them. So there's many benefits of simplicity. There's a fundamental problem, though, from a cognitive point of view, which is that out of sight, out of mind isn't just a saying, it's a reality. And so the problem is that once you filter things out, it's very, very easy to reason in a way that essentially forgets their existence. Even if you yourself was the one who's, turned some widget off a few moments ago, if you can't see it, it's really hard to systematically think about it. So you can filter both items or attributes. And we already talked a little bit about reducing attributes when we were discussing navigation. Now, aggregation is saying, well, there are some things that we don't want to explicitly draw, but instead of simply silently removing them, we're going to gather things together into some sort of meaningful group, and we're going to have a proxy for that group, and we're going to have a visual representation of that group. Now that sounds great. Of course, the devil is in the details. The big question is, well, how do you do that? There's all kinds of tricky nuances about how to avoid averaging out the very signal you're trying to preserve. So a great thing to do, but it's not necessarily obvious exactly how and what to do. A key point is these are not mutually exclusive. You can combine them. In fact, remember all these strategies that we had for dealing with complexity, we do typically combine all of them. So we combine reducing the data with interactivity in a changing view, with multiple views, and of course with deriving data. So typically for complex, sophisticated systems, we have a hybrid approach. So let's think about filtering. There's some nice systems to actually give you some useful data structures for doing this sort of what's called cross-filtering. So this is a form of item filtering where if you have multiple views, there's some nice support for actually being able to do this at scale, where remember we talked about scented histograms in a previous snippet, where there are these by sliders to control ranges, and you can actually see on the sliders the histogram of what the distribution is on that. And as soon as you move these sliders, all the rest of the views immediately update, because what got filtered out are all the parts of it that are not in range of the slider where you actually made a selection. So what's another form of aggregation? So that was filtering. Let's think a little bit about aggregations, and that tends to be the even trickier situation. So certainly histogram is the most well-known form of aggregation. It's a static form at the item level. It's supporting the task of understanding a distribution. And from an analysis point of view, what's going on in a histogram is that we take some sort of tabular data and we make a new table. We derive the data, and the new table, the keys of that new table are bins, and the values are the counts of things within the bin. So here we've got, again, with our overweight cats example. Now the key thing is that bin size is crucial. The pattern can change really dramatically depending on what discretization you set, how many bins you chop this up into. One opportunity for adding interaction is to allow people to easily control the bin size on the fly, so that they can actually quickly explore through different possibilities rather than just have to guess and iterate. So I mentioned this idea of scented widgets, of having histograms that are actually on top of sliders. So let's dig into that a little bit more. You might wonder what the name is all about. It's an idea from the research lab Park, where they talked about this idea of an information scent, and they had this information foraging theory, which was just like animals run around looking for food and trying to decide where to go next that might be fruitful. Knowledge workers are foraging for information, and they're trying to decide when you should drill down into something for more detail. So this idea of augmenting standard widgets so that what normally you might think of as just a control surface also is showing information about the data set. So we already saw one example of a scented widget a few minutes ago with cross-filtering. Here's another example. The details of what's going on in that large view down there with these multivariate networks isn't my main point. I want you to notice that just along the side in a pretty compact way, we've got a bunch of these little histograms. And in fact, there's very, very compact bisliders that allow you to select ranges and do cross-filtering there. And the thing to notice is with a pretty small number of pixels, you can immediately see, aha, some of these attributes are clearly normal distributions, some of these power law drop-offs, some must be categorical because we see something where we don't seem to see any sort of variation in heights at all. So that can be another quite powerful approach. Continuing to think about aggregation, box plots, of course, another very famous form of aggregation. Again, this is a way you can think about it through our analysis lens as derived data. You have your original table, you compute these 5 quantitative attributes, and the key thing about these is that it doesn't matter how many original items you had in your table, the size of the box plot is finite, it's fixed, it's constant. So we're often wanting to have situations where you can take even huge amounts of data and then summarize. Now, of course, as we talked about at the beginning, we don't want to only summarize. We often want to link these summaries with something that allows us to dive in, to see more details, to go back and forth between rolling up and drilling down. So here's an interesting one that you may well not have seen, this idea of a continuous scatter plot. So this is also an approach to aggregation, and it's trying to tackle one of the main problems with a scatter plot, which is, well, what about overplotting? What if you have a lot of points and they're all on top of each other? How can you tell? So in this case, it's an interesting play with derived data. You have your original data, which is some table, and you've got the 2 attributes that you would normally plot. And then what you do is you think about plotting them where you're actually dividing up the plot itself into a small grid where you've got XY locations of pixels in that grid, and you actually come up with a quantitative attribute, which is the density of overplotting, how many dots fall into that same pixel within your grid. And so you really think of this then as something where you can then visually encode the amount of overplotting. In this case, they're using a sequential categorical color. They're using a categorical color map for the sequential, and they have also got the ordered luminance. So using all the ideas we learned in the color map section. And the nice thing about this is, even if you had millions of items, you'd still be able to actually see what was going on in the scatter plot, as opposed to when you treat it simply as a discrete situation where you might have a serious problem with overplotting. So this is a way to think about scalability, and aggregation is often a specific solution to scalability. Let's think about aggregation for spatial data, an interesting problem. So cartographers have long known of what they call MAUP, the modifiable aerial unit problem, which is basically addressing this really fundamental issue that just like if you change the bins of a histogram, you might get pretty different results. We've got this problem even more deeply with the sort of 2-dimensional spatial aggregation. If you change the boundaries of cartographic regions, you can have dramatically different results. Here's a great illustration of what they call zone effects, where we've got the same data set in all 3 of these pictures, but just based on how you chop this up into zones, whether regular or irregular or these Voronoi cells, the pattern we see visually, where we've color-coded each of these regions according to how many yellow dots fall within it, we see completely different patterns. And it just has to do with what are the region boundaries. So aggregation is extremely tricky. We can also see scale effects where depending on the size of the regions that you're chopping things up into, again, you can get a dramatically different sense of a data set simply according to the granularity that you're looking at. So aggregation has a lot of nuances and trickiness, particularly for spatial data. Let's think about aggregation more dynamically, not just as something we do statically, but we could aggregate in an interactive context where we can change aggregation levels on the fly. What's very common when we do this is to derive the data of a hierarchical clustering. We mentioned this a while back when we were talking about graph drawing and the multi-level graph drawing of taking the original raw data and then clustering it together. So in this case, it's hierarchical parallel coordinates. So remember that we talked about that in a previous section as well. So, and I said there were some pretty strong scalability limits. We wouldn't be able to handle, say, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of data points because we would just see a big overplotting mess. So what they propose to do here is to run a hierarchical clustering. So we aggregate together the most similar parallel coordinate points, which of course are these jagged polylines, and then do this recursively all the way up to the root. So at the root, you have one single cluster that is actually the entire, more than 10,000 point data set. And then when we look at that on the left, we see the line that goes through the middle, and then these gradual fading out showing the range that's within the cluster. And then if we interactively say, okay, show me more clusters, maybe move the cluster slider, now we start to see multiple of these clusters visually depicted. The range of min-max now starts to shrink as we're actually digging down in. We can go and see maybe, say, 10 or 12 of these clusters. So although it's starting to get cluttered, we're seeing a view of the data that would be impossible to see if we were just looking at all 10,000 of the original data points. So we're trying to preserve the structure and have a proxy for the group that we're showing visually. Now, one more thought. We've been really focused on aggregation for items. What does it even mean to aggregate attributes? And the answer is, this is a very active area of research. It's typically called dimensionality reduction. I mentioned that although I use the word attribute to think about these, sometimes people call them variables or dimensions. And particularly in this context where you think of high dimensional data, then dimensionality reduction is a way to try to say, if we have some high dimensional space that we suspect has interesting and useful structure in a much lower dimensional space, can we derive that space using a bunch of mathematical algorithms to try to capture as much of the variance as possible? Now, this is going to work well when you have a good reason to believe that there really is a much lower dimensional structure. Perhaps what you want to measure, you just cannot measure directly, and you have a huge amount of redundancy in what you can measure, and you're trying to grab out the actual interesting signal there. In a machine learning context, these are often called latent factors or hidden variables. This is an area of strong overlap between visualization and machine learning. So just as a concrete example, say that what you want to know is whether a tumor is malignant or benign. We don't have a measurement device that tells you that, but we can measure all kinds of other things and then see if we can actually capture some structure. Here is an example where we took a 9-dimensional measurement space and mapped it down into a 2-dimensional space and then color-coded by a known classification of the benign versus the malignant tumors. And what you can notice is that even if you didn't have this color coding, you would see some structure. You would see a cluster structure with the benign being a much tighter and more visible density compared to the broad spread out malignant one. So we're seeing that we're actually able to capture some sort of structure. In this case, we color coded by ground truth, but we're typically doing this in contexts where we don't have ground truth. One more example of where dimensionality reduction is very commonly used is when you're dealing with very, very high dimensional spaces of huge document collections. So the so-called bag of words model, really common in natural language processing, is where we think of a big collection of documents. Say you had 10,000 documents, and say that you just keep track of every single word used across every single document. That might even be 10,000 words. If you think about then saying, well, I've got a really huge table where for every document I check, is this word used, and I write down the number of times it's used, we've got this very, very sparse and very, very huge table. Of course, we can't just visualize that directly. It has 10,000 dimensions. But we could try to run these dimensionality reduction techniques to produce a new data set along the way that's this dimensionally reduced data set, and then we could plot that in a scatter plot, and then we could actually do things like try to annotate and maybe understand the semantic meaning of some of these clusters of documents. So that's an example of a very common use of dimensionality reduction in visualization and natural language processing. Again, much more reading for this. Now, we're nearing the end of the tutorial, and there's certainly some stuff in the Visualization Analysis and Design textbook that's not been covered, a number of rules of thumb, also the idea of embedding both focus and contextual information with a careful combination of aggregation and filtering. That's sort of a sophisticated version of reducing data. But what we will do for now is wrap up. We've had quite a whirlwind tour of trying to really cover a huge amount of the space of visualization, although at a somewhat shallow level. So we've talked about what, why, and how. We've talked about those 4 levels of domain level, abstraction level, idiom level, and algorithm level. This tutorial has been very focused on the abstraction and the idiom level. We have only very tangentially discussed algorithms, although that's a huge, obvious topic of its own. But there's only so much we can do in one tutorial. And with this, I will wrap up. If people are curious about, first of all, the slides for this tutorial are available online. This tutorial is actually based on a book, Visualization Analysis and Design, that's available. I want to thank Eamon McGuire for some fantastic illustrations. And a lot of my own research work is also available both on my group's website and my own, including many papers and videos and software and talks, and in fact, the full content of every course I've ever taught. So with that, it's time to end the lecture part and move on to questions. See you in the chat room. Bye-bye.